Today, walking into a weed dispensary is a completely normal, everyday thing. They're clean, they're legal, they're on street corners everywhere, and honestly, they feel just about as exciting as walking into a pharmacy. But the very first one was absolutely nothing like that at all. It was born right in the middle of a deadly epidemic. It was run by an outlaw activist, and it existed as a genuine act of love for the sick. This is the story of the Cannabis Buyers Club. So to really understand this club, you first have to understand the times it was born into. Because back in the 1980s, a terrifying new disease was tearing its way through the city of San Francisco. It's a disease that starts with the letter A and ends with the letter S. I'm not sure if YouTube will let me say it flat out, so I'm not going to say it. But besides that, at the time, the disease was hitting the city's community with a devastating force. There was no cure for it. The government was painfully slow to respond, and thousands upon thousands of young men were getting sick and passing away from it. And one of the cruelest parts of this whole disease was what it did to the body. Because the illness itself, along with the harsh early medicines used to fight it, often made people completely unable to eat. They would lose their appetite entirely, feel a constant crushing nausea, and just slowly waste away to nothing. But over time, people started to discover that one single thing genuinely seemed to help them. And that thing was cannabis. Because it brought their appetite back, it calmed down all that nausea, and it eased their pain, letting them actually eat and hold on to life just a little bit longer. And this brings us directly to a man named Dennis Peron. He was a passionate rights activist for a certain community. I'm not sure I'm allowed to talk about on here, but besides that, he was also a Vietnam War veteran and a very well-known figure around San Francisco who had been openly selling weed for years and years. And he was even a close personal friend and ally of the famous politician Harvey Milk. But the one thing that truly changed his entire life and ended up changing weed history right along with it was falling in love. Because Dennis Peron's partner was a young man named Jonathan West, and Jonathan was very ill with that disease. In his final year of life, cannabis was one of the only things in the world that gave him any real relief at all. But then one day, the police raided their home, and they arrested Peron for the weed that was there. And in a genuinely heartbreaking moment, Jonathan, who was gravely ill and weighed barely 90 pounds at that point, went into a courtroom and testified that the weed was actually his. The charges against Peron were dropped, and just a very short time after that, Jonathan sadly passed away. Peron would later say that in the depths of his grief, he made a decision. He decided that he was going to leave Jonathan a lasting legacy of love. And that legacy very quickly became the Cannabis Buyers Club. Because Peron opened it up specifically so that sick people could finally buy their weed openly and with some real dignity instead of having to score it in the shadows like criminals. And he was not hiding it at all. This was a completely public and deeply defiant act of pure compassion right out in the open, even though weed was still 100% illegal at the time. And what made the place so special wasn't just how open it was was how it actually felt to walk inside, because it eventually grew into a huge 5-story building. But on the inside, it felt nothing like some cold, sterile pharmacy or a stuffy doctor's office. Instead, it felt a whole lot more like a warm, comfortable, and welcoming living room. There were rugs on the floors, plants and aquariums all around, and comfortable furniture everywhere you looked. Different types of weed would sit out on display under glass cake covers, and the people selling it actually became some of the very first bud tenders the world had ever seen. They even served free food to people and kept nutritional shakes stocked in the fridge, specifically for all the members who were simply too sick to eat any solid food. And word about this place started to spread fast. The club got to the point of having somewhere between 8 and 12,000 total members. And by Dennis Peron's own personal estimate, about half of those members had the disease we mentioned earlier. But besides that, the rules to get into the club were pretty straightforward. All a person really needed was a simple letter from a doctor, just confirming that they were sick. Now, no story about this legendary club would ever be complete without one more truly iconic figure. And that was a woman named Mary Jane Rathbun, though everybody knew her by her much more famous nickname, Brownie Mary. She was this sweet, kind, grandmotherly woman who lovingly baked weed brownies for all the sick patients and treated those sick young men just like they were her very own kids. She got herself arrested multiple times for doing it too, but she completely and utterly refused to ever stop. In fact, after one of her arrests, she famously said that if the police actually thought she was going to stop baking for her dying kids, then they were sorely mistaken. And she said it in much more colorful language than that. She became a beloved symbol of the entire movement. A true hero, if you ask me. So thanks to heroes like her and Peron, this club became famous all over the world. In fact, it's very famously called the first weed dispensary in all of America. And that is mostly true, but it honestly deserves a small, honest little asterisk to go along with it. Because it was really the first public, openly operating dispensary in the entire country. Weed shops had actually already existed over in Amsterdam for decades before this one ever opened its doors. And even right there in San Francisco, this club actually grew directly out of a smaller and much less public collective that had come just before it. There's even a bit of debate about the exact year it truly began. So it's completely fair to call it the first real American dispensary, just as long as you also know that fuller story behind it. But this club was always about so much more than simply selling weed, because it was also a political weapon. See, Peron and all of his allies took the huge amount of momentum they were building, and they used it to start actually changing the real laws. First, they managed to pass a local San Francisco measure, which clearly showed that the city overwhelmingly supported medical weed. But their real, ultimate goal was so much bigger than just one city, because they wanted to change the entire law for the whole state of California. But the state government was not going to let all of this just slide by quietly. Because back in 1996, right in the very middle of their massive campaign, the state's top law enforcement official sent nearly 100 narcotics agents to go and raid the club. They broke down the doors, they seized just about everything inside, and they completely shut the entire place down. And at the time, it genuinely looked like a devastating, crushing blow to the entire medical weed movement. But that raid ended up completely backfiring, because instead of actually killing the movement off, the act of violently shutting down a club that was full of sick and dying patients created this massive wave of public sympathy. People all over were outraged by it. In fact, the city's own mayor and its sheriff both openly sided with the club, standing against the state. So that raid, the one that was specifically meant to crush them all, actually ended up fueling their entire cause more powerfully than ever before. And ultimately, this whole fight came right down to a single, statewide vote. It was called Proposition 215. And when the final results all came in on Election Day, it officially passed. And this was a massive and truly historic moment for the whole country. Because with that one single vote, California officially became the very first state in all of America to legalize marijuana for medical use. The sick and the dying finally had the law itself standing on their side. And Dennis Peron, the lifelong outlaw activist, had personally helped to write it. Now, this whole story isn't some perfectly clean and simple fairy tale, though, because Dennis Peron himself was honestly a pretty complicated guy. The club was famously chaotic, and it was very loosely run, and a lot of its critics argued that it was frankly just a little too easy for people to get inside of it. And Peron also had this one core belief that he never, ever wavered on for a second. He genuinely believed deep down that all weed use was medical in some way, shape, or form. And because of that specific belief, years later, he would actually go on to oppose the movement to fully legalize weed just for fun, because he saw it as a corporate takeover of his entire life's mission. But no matter how complicated the man himself might have been, Dennis Peron's impact is completely and totally undeniable. Because that one single defiant little club in San Francisco lit the fuse for the entire medical marijuana movement all across the country. In fact, just about every single legal dispensary that exists anywhere today owes at least a small piece of its existence to that 5-story outlaw clubhouse. And at its very core, it's a story that had almost nothing to do with just getting high. Instead, it's really a story about a group of outcasts, bravely fighting for basic human compassion during a terrible plague that the rest of the world was mostly just trying to ignore. So at the end of the day, the Cannabis Buyers Club was always so much more than just the first dispensary. It was a true act of love, and it stands as one of the single most important chapters in all of weed history. So what about you? Did you have any idea that the very first weed dispensary in America was actually born right out of the crisis? Let me know down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this one, do me a favor and hit that like button. Subscribe for more deep dives like this one, and I'll catch y'all in the next one.